In families, it is very difficult to excise and just pull out one toxic family member and keep the rest. Families tend to be a package deal. And siblings represent a unique challenge. Some folks find the sibling relationship so toxic that they had to chuck the whole family relationship, a choice that often resulted in lifelong grief. Today, we're going to take on a very interesting question, which is those of you with narcissistic siblings. Could all of this have started when you were children? And please subscribe if you're new to this channel. But let's talk about this. Let's talk about these narcissistic siblings, because a lot of people have been asking for this content. So a question I get from a lot of people is, could this have all started when we were children? I know I don't actually talk enough on this channel about narcissistic siblings, and I recognize that it's a very important topic. Every day we get more and more emails from people whose struggle is not parents or partners or bosses, but siblings. Sibling relationships can be quite powerful, and they can be as formative and as impactful, if not more so, than a parental relationship sometimes. What gets so tricky about sibling relationships is that unless there's a large age gap between you and a sibling, when your siblings were children, you were a child too, right? So you obviously you grew up together. Now, as a rule, we don't really call children narcissistic. By definition, one could argue that maybe all children are narcissistic because they're egocentric, and they're supposed to be egocentric, right? They're growing themselves, and they're somewhat dysregulated. It's what children do until they differentiate and learn about the needs of the other people around them and learn to regulate and get empathy and all the rest of it. But there is increasing research showing that the soft signs of what the soft signs of narcissism may look like in children, and that may sort of foment into adulthood as full-blown narcissism. These signs include things like having a very difficult temperament, being very demanding of attention, having difficulty soothing themselves, children who are not able to do things on their own, like sort of play by themselves. They always need someone with them. Children who really can't abide by the rules, a sort of miniature entitlement. Children who actually walk around believing that they're better than other children, children who can't share, children who manipulate or bully younger children, or children who may not be as strong as them or as supported as them. So these are all sort of soft signs. None of them are a guarantee, but they're definitely risk factors for adult narcissism. And if these kids with these patterns are older siblings, I can tell you they're pissed as hell when a new sibling turns up. Listen, for many, if not most children, they're excited about a sibling. They look at the sibling as a potential pal or a little baby doll or even a friend. And many older siblings want to name their younger sibling or sing to them or read to them. But definitely not the kids that end up rolling into narcissism, almost to a T. They do not appreciate what they consider to be an interloper sibling showing up. They may say mean things about their sibling. They may even do mean things to them. And parents really have to have a watchful eye to ensure that this kind of an older sibling doesn't harm the new baby or young child. Now, as a child, if you had siblings, you likely have very conflicted memories of the sibling that may have grown up to become a narcissistic adult. Things like competitiveness, bullying, being set up to do things and then getting in trouble for them, being put into dangerous situations by the sibling, being yelled at, being stolen from. None of this is normal stuff. And some people may try to play it off as, oh, that's just sibling rivalry, but it's not. Almost to a T, when I have spoken with people who have adult siblings who are narcissistic, they do not have any sunny memories of the sibling in early childhood. They instead remember bullying, meanness. They don't remember anything good, even from those early years with that sibling. If you have only one sibling and that sibling is narcissistic, it sucks, and it can really bring up so much grief. A sibling relationship is such a unique relationship, and to have your shared historian of childhood be someone who actually never liked you and may have even harmed you can feel like such a fundamental and primal loss. And then when you throw in people saying things like, oh, siblings have to stick together, and yet your sibling has only undermined and harmed you, the minimization and the gaslighting can feel absolutely desolate. Sadly, narcissistic siblings are masterful at triangulation and as often depicting you as the person who is the one with the problem and is being standoffish and difficult. In adulthood, many folks with narcissistic siblings end up trying to distance from them. That's not always easy if you're trying to simultaneously also maintain contact with maybe other family members you're okay with, and those other family members may try to push you back together in the name of family harmony. And again, the narcissistic sibling who wants validation and admiration from the family system will often paint you as being the problem because you're the one who's going no contact, or you're the one who's not responding, or you're the one who's just not going along with them, while the narcissistic sibling is the one who may be sort of staying in touch with everyone because it's a way of them getting validation. The harm of a narcissistic sibling can be lifelong and can have impacts on how you care for aging parents, and the odds are that it'll all fall on you, while somehow they will still manage to grab up the lion's share of an inheritance or avoid the debt. How family finances, business, real estate, and trusts and wills are managed, once again, odds are that they're going to try to take far more than they're entitled to. The childish competitions persist into adulthood, and the grief will be magnified when other people, such as your parents and others in the family system, don't recognize how poisonous your sibling is. Watch a few episodes of Succession. Whether billionaires or paupers, the impact of narcissistic siblings is very toxic. So, to the original question, yes. It did start when you were children. This didn't all of a sudden just start when you were adults and you recognize your sibling was narcissistic. More and more observational work shows us that narcissistic adults were not nice children. They were often difficult, attention-seeking, pain-in-the-ass kids who grow up into difficult, attention-seeking, pain-in-the-ass adults. And if you were a sibling to them, especially if you were a sweet and empathic kid, it was open season on you. And if either of your parents were either narcissistic or just tuned out, they didn't notice it, or they just minimized it, again, as sibling rivalry or as normal sibling stuff. It's painful when you recognize that you may have been experiencing narcissistic abuse at the hands of a sibling since you were a child. But it seems to me that that's typically how it goes. Now, obviously, if you have a narcissistic parent, you wouldn't have known your narcissistic parent as a child. But I'm guessing that they were difficult, pain-in-the-ass, attention-seeking kids too. If you are curious, you should ask older family members who may have been witness to your parents' childhood. They may give you an honest answer, and it'll give you sort of a fuller picture of how these are often lifetime developmental patterns. To manage a narcissistic sibling in adulthood means the usual rules of narcissistic management: boundaries, realistic expectations, radical acceptance, don't defend, don't engage, don't personalize, usual drill. But it's not easy, and the grief of not actually having this sibling relationship, maybe never having had it, can impact many areas of your life. I've been struck by how pervasive the lifelong impact of narcissistic sibling relationships can be, and so profound because they've been happening since you were a child. Basically, it means you have never had a break from narcissistic abuse. So if you do have an adult narcissistic sibling, I'd love for you to pause and just sort of think for a minute, was it always difficult? Because I'm guessing in the vast majority of cases, you can even drop it in the comments, this was always a difficult relationship since you were small kids. Like I said, competitive, bullying, being manipulated to do things that weren't okay for you, being the person who took the blame, all of those things. They've always been there. So when this comes into starker relief in adulthood, you are able to look back and say, it's always been difficult. Be prepared, though, because if some things happen in the family system, these narcissistic siblings can really, really make things difficult, and the world often is not supportive because they'll say, oh, it's your sibling. Of course they have your back. And when they don't, you can feel very unheard, very lonely, and very unseen in the struggles you face. Can having a narcissistic sibling harm you in the same way a narcissistic parent can? So please drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of yeses. So again, it's a couple sibling videos. So on my recent travels, a woman recognized me in a hotel lobby. She thanked me for the YouTube channel and thanked me for the content. But then she said, I could tell she wanted me to do something. And she said, could you please talk about narcissistic siblings? She felt that it was a very specific corner that often didn't get addressed. but it had such a strong effect in her life. And since narcissistic siblings in these relationships can certainly send shockwaves through a family system, there's no reason it can't have as much effect as having a narcissistic parent. And since it's not unusual for a person with a narcissistic sibling to also have a narcissistic parent, that this may be operating as a sort of double jeopardy for people having both a narcissistic parent and a narcissistic sibling. When I sat down to think about this, I was filled with the stories of the numbers of people whom I have worked with over the years clinically who have narcissistic siblings. And when I really started writing it down, even people I've worked with years back, I was like, wow, this is a lot of people. Then I realized there are people I'm friends with and even people I'm related to, not me. I adore my sister. So no, this isn't about you. She's watching. But it was far more common, this idea of narcissistic siblings, than I was thinking. And because the narcissistic partner, narcissistic parent conversation often grabs our attention, we forget how often the narcissistic sibling is an issue. Now, narcissistic siblings are a tricky issue to talk about because there can be so many variations. Birth order, gender, half-siblings, step-siblings, bio-siblings, the list just goes on and on. So part of it is focusing on some of the universals of a sibling relationship and addressing the issue in this video, which is, can the harms of having a narcissistic parent and a narcissistic sibling be similar? Now again, some of this can relate to birth order. If the narcissistic sibling is an older sibling, then yes. One tell on a narcissistic sibling: they were not happy when you were born. Again, assuming that the narcissistic sibling is older. They were not happy. I've never heard of a situation. Person had an older narcissistic sibling. Then the person was born and the narcissistic sibling was pissed from that little age. And in almost every case where there was a living adult relative or parent, and in a few cases there was literally video evidence or a story like of the narcissistic sibling crying, or a story that the narcissistic sibling wrote about how much they don't like the new baby. Where lots of siblings may have a little suspiciousness about a new baby, there's also often a lot of welcoming and excitement about a new baby. Narcissistic siblings are not happy about an interloper, as though their little selves were already gearing up for needing supply and not liking competition for attention, that kind of thing. I mean, babies are always going to get the most attention. It mattered most in two-child homes, or when you were the next born after the narcissistic person. But no matter what, they did not like you coming in as a new baby. And the early discourse when you have a narcissistic sibling, it's competitive. And this would often then devolve into meanness. Again, assuming you're the younger sibling, manipulating that you as the younger sibling to their point of view, to do their bidding, to engage in activities that were not safe or would get you into trouble, or making you the fall person or the fall guy for the bad things that they did. In a similar way, the way a child tries to attach to a narcissistic parent, somebody with a narcissistic older sibling may try to do the same thing attached to that older sibling, and as a result may internalize blame and be encouraged by the narcissistic sibling to do that. And then you, if you have a narcissistic sibling, may be willing to take the blame for joint activities where something went wrong to protect and perhaps ally with the older sibling. The drive to belong, to feel accepted, and to feel close to the older sibling can be quite strong. And it can start unfolding in a trauma-bonded way. And this can be really compounded if you were a good-natured child. You may remember fights and arguments and the like, but then you may also remember terrible days that were stressful and upsetting. But the overarching theme was to want to be close to this sibling, no matter how bad they were to you. And yes, all siblings fight, but those siblings that go on to full-scale narcissism, even in childhood, it was something far more nefarious throughout your childhood. And those of you who have multiple siblings, you have one sibling, maybe more, but at least one who grew up to be narcissistic and others who were not narcissistic, you may recall that, yes. But when you argued, that the arguing felt different and probably more severe with the narcissistic sibling. And yes, you can become trauma bonded to a narcissistic sibling, regardless of whether or not you have a narcissistic parent. And some of this can become much worse, depending on family roles. For example, if the narcissistic sibling is a golden child and you had more of a scapegoated role, then you were being harmed in multiple ways. We cannot undo our childhoods. They happened. And frankly, we do not call children narcissistic because personality is still developing well into your mid-20s. While you can look backwards, though, you can definitely track the toxic person and someone who ended up as an adult narcissist. One survivor shared with me how his brother, ultimately narcissistic brother, regularly put him in extremely dangerous circumstances. And he looks back and says it was by sheer luck that he survived. He's a father now, and he shudders at the thought of his son being put in any circumstances even somewhat similar to what his brother did. But he also recalls his brother gaslighting him. And obviously he had no idea what that was, and calling him all kinds of names, implying that he was weak and a loser if he didn't do the dangerous thing. So it was all manipulation and gaslighting. And then when the man got hurt from these stunts his brother was making him do, his mother would criticize him and not the brother, who then claimed, the narcissistic brother would claim that he tried to talk his younger brother out of it, and the mother believed him. Now, culture can also matter. And in cultures where brothers are often given more power simply because they're male, regardless of where they are in birth order, they may take, for example, a controlling role in a sister's life quite early and already opining on her limitations. And in these cultures, boys are more often the golden child. So an elder brother in particular may have a permanent free pass to be as abusive as he wants. And in fact, the others in the family system may view it as a brother taking a preordained role in telling his sister or sisters what to do. That controlling behavior will often persist through a lifetime. I've seen like 85-year-old brothers still doing it to their 70-something-year-old sisters. But most of you are watching this as adults and not sure what to do. First of all, you have to recognize it's real. Sibling narcissistic issues and abuse are real. And it can be confusing because if there are more than two of you, more than two siblings in a family, you may have some siblings that are narcissistic and some that are not. You may or may not have had a narcissistic parent or have a narcissistic parent. Probably you do have one, but not definitely. And your parents, who may not see it clearly and are interested in maintaining the status quo or the illusion of a happy family, may enable this narcissistic sibling. Keep in mind, too, that when it comes to any family money, inheritance, estates, trust, any of that, or even family business, the narcissistic sibling will feel as though they have a disproportionate right to weigh in those matters, feel entitled to more of that pie, and will triangulate and tell the parents negative things about siblings to position themselves better around family assets. They may also feel that they have more of a right to weigh in on the health or the care of aging parents, and in many cases, they won't lift a finger, but feel that they have the right to offer up all kinds of suggestions to the siblings who are doing the actual work of managing the elderly parent or parents. But the original question was, can the harms of a narcissistic sibling be as bad as the harms of a narcissistic parent? And as I play out the myriad stories I have heard, the answer to that is a loud yes. Because siblings, unlike partners or colleagues or friends, were part of your developmental history. They were there as you grew up. Even if they were younger, they were there, and they were a developmental influence. And some of your early working models of trauma bonds may have been multiplied by the presence of a manipulative, entitled sibling who turned into a manipulative, entitled, narcissistic adult, and magnify any existing trauma-bonded relationships with your parent or parents. In the cases I have heard, the siblings' gaslighting was often worse and believed by other adults who viewed it as sibling squabbling, and the entitled, selfish, and cruel sibling would repeatedly remind you who's boss and that they would get away with it, and they often did. And in some cases, the sibling abuse you experienced may have been more severe. And many times, when a person is experiencing emotional abuse from a sibling, it goes unseen and not intervened in because it's often just written off as siblings being siblings. In adulthood, your tangles with a narcissistic sibling may be just as bad as your conflict with a narcissistic parent. And the presence of a narcissistic sibling may make, for example, attendance at any kind of family function really difficult, especially if your narcissistic sibling is really firmly wedged into the family system. Many people share with tremendous grief how they gave up on attending as many family events as they did and missed out on relationships that they actually valued with other family members just to avoid the narcissistic sibling. And families, as we know, are really funny, and not funny, haha, but funny in how they enable. And even the folks you like may look at you sideways and be willing to say, oh, come on now, that's who they've always been. Can't you figure out a way to get along with them? You become the problem for pointing out the problem. And nowhere is that more pronounced than in narcissistic sibling relationships. So those of you with narcissistic siblings, drop it in the comments if you feel comfortable. Because listen, given how many people out there are in intimate relationships or marriages with narcissistic people, or work with narcissistic people, or are friends with narcissistic people, or were raised by narcissistic people, unless they are all only children, they are someone's sibling. In a way, some people may not pay as much attention if they could move away from a sibling or distance from them, because that might be easier than from a parent. But since narcissistic siblings often have built-in supply and enabling and emboldening from a family of origin, they often stick close to that system. So these relationships can become very problematic if you still remain close to or have contact with your parents. If this is you and you have a narcissistic sibling, don't doubt yourself. And I'll continue to make videos and have more content to break down the strategies you can use to manage these relationships. These relationships can bring up so much grief, especially if it was just you and a sibling, just two-child home, because your sibling is often the only person who had that shared experience with you in childhood. And the grief over this loss, as well as ongoing grief, as they may interfere with your relationship and your parents and other family members you care about. And also how the voice of your sibling and the negative talk you internalized may be just as powerful as that of a narcissistic parent. So let's talk about what you have to sacrifice to keep the peace in a family system when you have a narcissistic sibling. The most painful part of family systems is that the status quo in many, if not most family systems, is more important than caring for the individual health of its individual members. And sadly, this is even an issue in moderately healthy family systems, not narcissistic. But it is the law of the land in narcissistic family systems. The larger whole, the collective and what it looks like to the public and maintaining its traditions and routines and ways of being are more important many times than the issues of an individual family member, especially if the pain for that individual family member is coming from within the confines of the family system, basically that their problems are because of the family. Now, this can show up in a variety of ways. A person in the family, let's say, for example, is in a marriage with someone narcissistic. And unless that narcissistic spouse is causing problems for the persons in their family, which they may not because the narcissistic person wants supply and is able to look good in public, that the family may actually be more concerned with the optics or the inconvenience of the divorce of the child from their family than your misery in the relationship. Or another example would be, a person in a family was once abused by a harmful family member in the past, and it wasn't addressed then. And when that person becomes an adult, they want to address it. The family system then, the family system that did nothing at the time, will tell you BS, like it's water under the bridge or it's the past, and just let it go. If it's your narcissistic parent, it can go a variety of ways. Again, we know different people, different roles in a narcissistic family. And if you have a sort of truth seer vibe and you make your feelings known, even when you are relatively young, once again, you are the problem. Or you may be called out as ungrateful or selfish, and depending on your culture, basically a big how dare you. Now, a sibling, let's say another example, a sibling who is continually manipulative, cruel, undermining, and nasty. And because you are the one who has raised an issue about your sibling, and obviously your family doesn't want to necessarily take note of your narcissistic family member's abuse, your sibling's abuse, because your sibling isn't saying there's a problem. They're just having a go at you. But because you're the one who raised the issue, then you're the one who's the problem. And you're told that you're the one who needs to adjust, not the narcissistic sibling. Now, these are all painful situations because you experienced something difficult. And while you may not have even thought that your family would fix it, at a minimum, you may have hoped that your pain would have been acknowledged, heard, or seen. And that is not likely. Again, this can be quite pronounced in the sibling situation, that no matter how atrocious the conduct of your sibling, that you are the problem because you keep raising problems. You're saying that there's an issue with your sibling's behavior, but you're saying that means that the family isn't perfect or at least even good anymore. In essence, you're creating an issue where everyone else in the family is committed to denial. Now, families may be the most complicated variant of narcissistic relationships because there's lots of people too. Because in many cases, not all, but many, people don't want to lose their entire family. There are often still people you value. You recognize their flaws and their problems and their issues, but that to maintain those connections, the price of admission is to silence yourself, to not raise issues, and allow the often false narrative of that the family is what's important, and that you don't want to be the one to draw bad attention to the family, and that persists. Now, siblings are tricky because these are, for many of us, long-term, perhaps lifelong relationships. And while, listen, we know child siblings fight. When that trails into adulthood, it gets tricky. Succession be damned, and by then, we would like to think that you aren't fighting over a toy when you are adults. Now, however, the only reason that a lot of people even speak to or have relationships with their siblings is because they're related to them. They would have never chosen this person to be a friend. And were it not for that sibling relationship, they wouldn't have anything to do with them. They don't even like them. Now, but not all, many siblings are sort of close-ish in age, which sometimes would imply a friendship, and parental fantasies exist about wanting the children to get along well into adulthood. That means anyone who has a narcissistic sibling is kind of screwed because the fantasy is done. Narcissistic parents sometimes create these circumstances and the tensions with a difficult sibling through early triangulation, comparison between siblings, fostering competitiveness, and the parents enjoying the power they get from fostering gossip in the family, and things like, you won't believe what your brother told me kind of BS. In other cases, narcissistic parents just want to maintain the holiday card fantasy of a family that is close-knit and ignore the concerns of others in the family, whether it is one or more siblings, about the narcissistic sibling. Again, in families, it is very difficult to excise and just pull out one toxic family member and keep the rest. Families tend to be a package deal. And siblings represent a unique challenge. Some folks find the sibling relationship so toxic that they had to chuck the whole family relationship, a choice that often resulted in lifelong grief. In other cases, people would endure the abuse from a narcissistic sibling so they could stay close to other family members. And this would only embolden the narcissistic sibling, who often gets off on having this sort of bully pulpit, you keep having to show up. Though, of course, they would never think of themselves as a bully. They just think of themselves as right. Now, keep in mind, too, that a narcissistic sibling can also be a gateway to a narcissistic sibling-in-law, or an entirely new narcissistic family system through marriage. At that point, the hypocrisy of your own family clucking at the new narcissistic in-laws' behavior, and them not seeing that the same things are happening in your very own family system, is enough to make you want to quit the entire enterprise with them. But when you are the one who senses a problem or raises concerns, and they may be concerns that could have massive ramifications, such as around the care of an older parent, financial issues, management of a family business, then you may even be told to figure it out, and that if you can't, then maybe you are the one being stubborn or the one with the problem. We do not talk enough about narcissistic siblings. And interestingly, this video was all inspired by a chance encounter with someone, but it opened my memory banks about the many situations I have been told about. Quite often, the little golden child remains the adult golden child. The young scapegoat still remains in that horrible role in adulthood, and all of you truth seers out there carry the gift and the weight of seeing it. There is also that terrible experience of hearing that, well, you only have one sister, or you only have one brother, as though that makes it better. They're trying to tell you, you got to work on it. This can actually often compound the grief, because you are reminded that, yep, aware of that. And so basically you're told that the only path forward is to suck it up while you are grieving that you didn't get to have the healthy experience of a sibling, or frankly, a family. Which, when a sibling relationship is healthy, it's very, very special, because it's someone who is a shared historian of your life. However, when you have a narcissistic sibling, they become the distorter of your history. Seeing the narcissism of a sibling and having it be invalidated or ignored by other people who are witnessing it feels deeply unjust. It's a form of abandonment. And no matter how much you try to point it out, listen, it's not even that they don't see it. It's very likely that some of your family members too, I should say, but they do not want to tip the apple cart. And it's devastating to realize that within a family, you're sort of an acceptable sacrifice to maintain a psychologically photoshopped version of the family. And thank you to that person who stopped me and suggested this video. Thanks again.